I didn't expect to come into work today to cover this. The US's top diplomat meeting with the Pope to defuse a war of words with President Donald Trump. This would be unprecedented for me as a journalist. Meghan Clark can give us perspective. She's a professor of theology at St John's University. Meghan, we'll look at the framing of this meeting in a moment. First, there are lots of accusations flying around. Trump calling the Pope weak on crime, terrible for foreign policy, suggesting Leo was wrong for opposing the war in Iran. Then things escalated Monday. Trump told a radio show the Pope would rather talk about the fact that it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, a false suggestion. And he said the Pope is endangering a lot of Catholics and a lot of people. We'll hear from the Pope in a second. First, can you unpack that for us, Meghan, and explain the relevance of those comments for Catholics?
I want to start by noting that President Trump really doesn't seem to understand what the papacy is, or really in many ways what the Catholic Church as a global church is, which complicates the matter. Simply because Pope Leo has preached peace and objected to the war in Iran, at no point has Pope Leo or any pope indicated that it's okay for anybody to have a nuclear weapon. Pope Francis spoke positively about the previous U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, which aimed at moving towards peace, that President Trump then dismantled in 2016 when he came to power the first time. But this idea that Pope Leo is somehow okay with anyone having nuclear weapons is quite absurd to anyone who's studied the last 60 years of papal diplomacy.
Well, Leo had this to say on Tuesday in the lead up to his election as pontiff a year ago on May 8th, the first US cardinal to rise to the papal throne, which has created this intriguing dynamic, I think you could call it, as we're finding out now.
I have spoken out from the very moment I was elected, and now we are approaching the anniversary. I have said, peace be with you. The Church's mission is to preach the gospel, to preach peace. If anyone wishes to criticize me for proclaiming the gospel, let them do so with the truth. For years, the Church has spoken out against all nuclear weapons, so there is no doubt about that. And I simply hope to be heard for the sake of the value of God's words.
So echoing your comments there, basically, and as you said, nothing unusual, nothing new. What are your thoughts, though, Meghan?
Well, and this is part of the challenge is, I think this is the first time ever where we're seeing a U.S. president, or probably any world leader, be surprised that the Pope preaches peace. I mean, it really is confounding. But the thing that is important is that Pope Leo has consistently preached peace over and over and over again. As he noted, it was the first words he came out and said when he was elected Pope, and he met the audience, the crowd in St. Peter's Square. But also, it isn't just a U.S. Rome situation. There was a lot of talk when he was in Africa on the U.S. side, right, in the press, as if he was responding to things that President Trump was saying, when, in fact, his speeches and remarks for the 4 countries on his African trip would have been set a couple weeks before he went and gone through translators. The Pope preaches peace everywhere he goes, to every community he goes, because we all need to hear the message of the gospel.
The Pope also criticised the world's tyrants, but went on to say that he wasn't directly referring to Trump. Why is it a problem, though, for the president having a Pope criticise the US-Israeli war on Iran or the administration's hardline anti-immigration policies?
This president doesn't handle criticism, period. And so there is that problem. But there's also the reality that even for those who are not Catholic, the Pope is a moral voice. And what we have seen is there's a desire for this administration to frame its actions, whether it be the crackdown against migrants here in the United States or in this current war, as if they are acting on the side of justice, as if they are the good, the good guys acting morally. And so it's a problem to have one of the, few really global moral voices that everyone acknowledges is a moral voice on the side of peace and justice, saying this is not right.
As far as framing goes, let's have a listen to the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio himself. He's the one at the meeting, as far as the agenda goes.
No, I mean, it's a trip we had planned from before, and obviously we had some stuff that happened. And no, look, there's a lot to talk about with the Vatican. I'll give you one example. The Pope just returned from a trip to Africa, where the church is growing very vibrantly. And we have shared concerns about religious freedom, freedom in different parts of the world. We'd love to talk to them about that. The topic of Cuba, we gave Cuba $6 million of humanitarian aid, but obviously they won't let us distribute it. We distributed it through the church. We'd like to do more. We're willing to give more humanitarian aid to Cuba, by the way, distributed through the church, but the Cuban regime has to allow us to do it. They won't allow us to give their own people more humanitarian aid, and we're willing to do it through the church. So there's a lot to talk about.
So denying that they're really going to be talking about damage control and a problematic president when it comes to the Pope, but is there a lot to talk about when it comes to Cuba and Africa?
Oh, there definitely is a lot to talk about. And this is where I would say that, Secretary Rubio is right. But we're also, it is, the timing is interesting. I would suspect that, among other things, that many in the Secretariat of State, so the Vatican Secretary of State, which would regularly have interactions with the U.S. Secretary of State, I expect things like PEPFAR and USAID and the cuts to global aid for HIV/AIDS medication and all of that development reality are of high priority to the Vatican. And so there is Cuba, but there is also a burgeoning crisis where we're losing ground in terms of access to medication and care as a result of the cutbacks on humanitarian aid in sub-Saharan Africa. And there, too, a lot of the U.S. aid that would go through PEPFAR and go through USAID would be distributed by the church. Oftentimes it is clinics and other programs run often by Catholic sisters that provide the healthcare and the medication. So there is a lot to talk about, and the church is in a unique position that they probably have much better intel about what's going on the ground in large parts of Africa than Secretary Rubio.
Then clarify for me, Meghan, who called this meeting?
That is unclear. I think it is likely that there was something on the books. I don't think Secretary Rubio is necessarily making that up, precisely because he's also meeting with the Italian government. But it is the kind of thing where an in-person meeting, it's hard to tell who called whom. At the same time, if he wants to meet with Italy as well, you're also going to kind of book the Vatican at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it is a closed-door meeting. You did mention the urgency when it comes to US aid. Why hasn't there been a meeting in such a long time? I believe this is the first visit between the Pope and a Trump cabinet official in nearly a year.
I would say that a lot of Vatican diplomacy, right, we don't hear about it and we don't see it. So the high-level meetings, this is the first meeting in a year. I'm not certain if that's usual or unusual in terms of how often members of the Biden cabinet, for example, would go to Rome. But I do know that it certainly wouldn't be the first time in a year that the administration and the Secretariat of State at the Vatican are in contact. But the reality is that Vatican diplomacy is a lot of soft power. It's about being a space for dialogue and trying to move people towards engagement and justice and peace and democracy and those kinds of things. So most of it, if you imagine kind of an iceberg, it's only the very little bit at top that we ever see. Most of it never becomes public.
But the constellation at the top, as you put it, is also interesting. The fact it's Rubio, who's Catholic, and not as abrasive as Vance, I think you could say, who himself only recently became Catholic.
And there is precedent for this. You send over a high-ranking or a trusted Catholic collaborator. Now, Rubio is in an official position, but in the run-up to the Iraq War, the Bush administration sent prominent U.S. conservative Catholics who were not in the administration, most notably people like Michael Novak and George Weigel, to meet with and try and negotiate, lobby the Vatican on their interpretation, on the Bush administration's interpretation of the war in Iraq. And so there is precedent to these efforts of having Catholics try and make your case. And I am sure that Marco Rubio will be trying to make the case for why the U.S. is engaged in this military action in Iran. At the same time, it didn't sway Pope John Paul II, and I don't imagine that it will sway Pope Leo to change at all his message of peace.
But who's the better Catholic to send, Rubio or Vance?
I think it's not so much a question of a better Catholic. I think Senator Rubio has significantly more international diplomacy experience than Vice President Vance, given his role in foreign relations for the Senate for a very long time. And so I think there is, yes, Vance has only recently become Catholic, but I do think also there's just Secretary Rubio has far more diplomatic experience than most of the Trump administration.
And Meghan, you talk about all of this communication going on in the background, but why hasn't Trump himself met the new Pope? I mean, according to the public record, the first American Pope hasn't had any direct contact with Trump. They haven't even met.
I think we need to remember as well that kind of a Pope Leo Trump meeting is it's heads of state in that category of what's involved in a meeting. So Trump can't just show up for a closed door meeting in the way that Secretary Rubio can, or even a vice president can. Right? If Trump goes, it's like when Emmanuel Macron goes, or right, it is a official head of state visit. So there's a lot more involved, a lot more at stake. But it is the fact that the Pope is from the United States definitely impacts how his message hits. And so I think that makes it more, I mean, we're seeing President Trump's frustration. But I think the question of when it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense right now if we saw a visit to Rome. And we know that at least for the the short term, Pope Leo is not going to be coming to the United States in the near future.
Well, for a moment, let's get into Pope Leo's mindset. He's critical of Gaza, like his predecessor. He visited Lebanon. But does he stand out for you then from other leaders of the Catholic Church?
What I think is so striking about Pope Leo, for me as an American, is I do think there is a power in his ability to speak, to preach the same message his predecessors spoke, but to do so in English, using colloquial English, using, sounds like someone from the Midwest of the United States, which he is. And so he's able to connect without it being through translation. And I think that means that the regular kind of Catholics who are listening in the United States, they understand exactly what he's saying. They understand what he means in a more direct way. And it's relatable because of that. But I also think Pope Leo is very clearly a very reflective, deliberate speaker. And so even as we see his interactions and answering questions on these trips, there's a different tone to those plain press conferences with Pope Francis, in part because we can see the way that Pope Leo deliberates as he's carefully speaking. And so because he doesn't do as many of those, right? They kind of are punchier. We pay more attention to them when they come.
So how much influence would you say the Pope has over US voters?
I don't think it is really about influence over voters in terms of the Pope will never tell anyone how to vote. But what I do think the current administration is really risking is that by attacking the Pope, and by attacking the Pope in ways that are just really disrespectful, what you end up doing is alienating Catholics and other, especially mainline Protestants, in ways that they know that it's wrong. And we saw this with the AI images and some of these attacks that within Trump's supporters, people were offended. And everyone expects, even if they don't agree with the Pope, they expect the Pope to preach peace. And so they expect the Pope to be treated with respect. And so I do think there's a real risk, I think, and this might be part of what hopefully, Rubio's visit in a US politics sense, is that there's a real risk that they are alienating people of faith who they want to turn out and vote for their party in November. And the more and more you seem like you are making fun of the Pope, attacking the Pope, calling the Pope dangerous, you really risk alienating people who see the Pope as a spiritual and moral leader.
Well, let's just take a look at that image, that AI-generated image you're talking about, and tell me, what is the relationship like at the moment between the Catholic Church and Trump?
This image really offended a lot of people, more so even than some of the things he was saying about the Pope. And that was because it put Trump in the position of Jesus. So it isn't even just about the Pope. Now we're talking about Jesus Christ. And so there is a real tenuous relationship because of what is going on in the United States with migration in particular. And so there is a strong, clear public voice that we are hearing from church leaders in the United States about the dignity of immigrants and the dignity of migrants and the right of the church to care for and to demand fair and humane treatment of people in detention, access to religious sacraments for people in detention. And so there is a huge kind of tension point, and we're seeing retribution, what feels like retribution from the administration, pulling Catholic charities, funding from the diocese in Miami and others as what feels like punishment. But the reality is that whether it's the Bishop of Rome and Pope Leo, or it's the Bishop of Washington, D.C., or Chicago, or Miami, they aren't political figures. They are men who are supposed to preach the gospel. And Jesus was very clear about welcoming the stranger, about the importance of blessed are the peacemakers. And so they're, the tension's just unavoidable at this point.
What about the timing of the meeting today between Rubio and the Pope? There are midterms coming up in the US.
So I think that right now this meeting is unlikely to have much influence, or that people will really even remember it come November. The general public, kind of American popular opinion, has a very short attention span. And so I really think right now we're talking more about what is the diplomatic relationship, but also the critiques on what's going on in Iran, and the fact that we know that Pope Leo met with a number of priests in southern Lebanon by FaceTime. He surprised them to show solidarity with them over the last couple of days. So I think these global issues are more what this meeting is about, including things like Africa and Cuba. But I think as we move forward towards November, if the president keeps targeting the Pope, then I think it really does risk being a problem for Republicans in the midterms. But I don't think Secretary Rubio's visit to the Vatican will have any impact on kind of that political reality.
But surely November
It's just too
would
far
be,
away.
and because it's so far away, I mean, surely that would be enough time for them to set up a personal meeting between Trump and the Pope, wouldn't you say? And couldn't Rubio be paving the way for that visit today?
It would be interesting. And I will fully admit, I don't know how that calculus happens in terms of the Holy See. I don't know how or what they're thinking. I do know that the Pope and the Vatican take very, very, very seriously the role of dialogue, and the fact that they have a table that is able to bring people together, unlike really any other institution that exists. And so if a meeting does happen, kind of there will be, because of possibilities that the Vatican sees it can play in advancing the cause of peace. But I don't know. That is not something that is public at all, how they make those decisions.
But it would surely be valuable for Trump getting a pic of him with the Pope shaking hands. At the end of the day, though, Meghan, what could Trump and the Catholic Church achieve for the world?
I think that one positive thing that could come out of this meeting is if there is more attention to humanitarian aid to Cuba and the restoring of humanitarian aid in sub-Saharan Africa. These were things that Secretary Rubio valued before he joined this administration. And so personally, I think there might be space diplomatically in order for positive movement to happen between the Vatican and the United States on restoring some of this humanitarian aid. Because the reality is that for a lot of humanitarian aid in places that are the hardest to get to, it is often the church and other faith-based groups who are the ones who are able to deliver food and medicine and care.
Yeah, we forget about that huge network that's set up around the world. Meghan Clark from St. John's University, great getting your take today on DW.
Thank you for having me.
And what do you think? Should religious leaders keep out of politics? And should politicians leave religion alone? Let us know in the comments. I'm Ben Fajzullin. See you again soon.